Hi, welcome to IBD Journal Club Nutrition Corner, February 2021. My name is Colleen Webb. I'm an IBD-focused dietitian, and I'm delighted to be here. In this short presentation, we will discuss a review article published in May 2020 in Clinical Gastroenterology and Hepatology titled Dietary Guidance from the International Organization for the Study of Inflammatory Bowel Diseases. This is a very important document because there's a lack of strong evidence-based guidelines recommending specific dietary therapy for those with established disease. But we know diet's important and patients want to know what to eat, so clinicians need to be able to provide helpful dietary guidance. The IOIBD analyzed best available evidence to provide recommendations on foods that are beneficial, harmful, and safe. They reviewed literature for a selection of food groups, dietary components, and food additives that they thought were most important. And they provided their recommendations separately for UC and Crohn's disease, choosing from one of the four categories: prudent to increase consumption, prudent to decrease, safe to consume, or insufficient evidence. Each recommendation was supported by an evidence level. When possible, the review focused on the effect of diet on both inflammation and symptoms, and members voted on recommendations with consensus defined as more than 75% agreement. Moving on to recommendations. So fruits and vegetables are obviously very important for gut health, partly because of their fiber content, and that's really what the authors highlighted in this narrative. In Crohn's disease, it's prudent to recommend moderate to high consumption, except for patients with stricture in Crohn's disease who should restrict insoluble fiber. In UC, there's insufficient evidence to recommend any specific change or restriction. And a huge takeaway here is that evidence does not support limiting or avoiding fruits or vegetables except with stricture in Crohn's. For refined sugars and carbs, for both Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, there is insufficient evidence to recommend any specific change of intake. It's a little unclear specifically what carbohydrates they're referring to. I'm guessing it's grains and starchy vegetables. They also looked at FODMAPs and found that a low FODMAP diet can help manage symptoms in those with inactive disease. And they pointed out that the specific carbohydrate diet, a popular IBD diet, has been shown to reduce symptoms and promote mucosal healing, and this diet excludes refined sugars and sucrose. In looking at wheat and gluten on their own, they found that for both Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, there's insufficient evidence to recommend restriction. But they do point out that gluten and or other wheat protein components might drive intestinal inflammation, although there's no data to show whether a gluten-free diet leads to mucosal healing. Patients frequently report symptomatic improvement with gluten restriction, but we need to keep in mind that gluten coexists with FODMAP, so symptomatic improvement might be related to reduced FODMAP intake. Consensus was not obtained for pasteurized dairy products for Crohn's or UC. Dairy is complicated. It includes a wide variety of natural, processed, and ultra-processed foods, also with varying levels of lactose, and IBD patients have been shown to have a higher prevalence of lactase deficiency. Consensus for unpasteurized dairy is that they should not be consumed for fear of infection. Animal protein has been linked to a significantly increased risk of IBD. As for those with Crohn's disease, there is evidence that it is unnecessary to restrict moderate consumption of unprocessed red meat, lean chicken meat, and eggs. This is consistent with the benefits founded with the Crohn's disease exclusion diet that requires people eat these foods. In UC, it is prudent to reduce intake of red and processed meat, no evidence to recommend changes to poultry consumption, and no mention of eggs. In looking at dietary fats in isolation, they recommend that people with Crohn's should reduce consumption of saturated fats. So in a sense, they are recommending that people with Crohn's eat less meat and less dairy, since those are major food sources of saturated fats. For both Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, people should avoid trans fats. With UC, it is prudent to reduce consumption of myristic acid, which is a saturated fatty acid found in palm oil, coconut oil, and dairy fats, and prudent to increase dietary consumption of omega-3 fats from fish, not from supplements. For alcohol, for both Crohn's and UC, there is insufficient evidence to recommend changes in low-level consumption, but many patients do identify alcohol as a potential trigger for worsening symptoms. Finally, food additives. Food additives are added to ultra-processed foods to improve texture, shelf stability, overall quality of food products. They are associated with negative changes in the gut flora, intestinal permeability, and inflammation, findings mostly from animal models. And for all of these, they recommend reducing or limiting exposure for both Crohn's and UC. A key strength of this article is that it provides evidence-based guidelines to serve as a starting point of discussion on diet and IBD. There are some limitations, too, I'll call out. One is the review did not include studies on commonly recommended diets like the SCD, or the specific carb diet, and dietary components don't reflect dietary patterns. I'm thinking of my UC patients who eat mostly plant-based, unprocessed, minimally processed foods diets. They probably don't have to worry about a little bit of coconut oil. I'll leave you with this nice user-friendly chart from the review article that summarizes their key findings. With that, I thank you for listening. Take care.